order, whoops, thank you for turning me on. I want to call to order the Walton County TDC's public workshop relative to new legislation coming on the scene at the state level.
Perfect. Thank you,
Turn it over to
Amy.
Matt.
I appreciate it. Just wanted to take the opportunity today to gather some of our council members together and offer some updates for those who may be watching online, just as it relates to some bills making their way through session. What we understand is there's some bills that would directly impact the utilization of TDT or how those funds are used, kind of making their way through session, which may, if everything would work in a speediest manner, end up Friday. But what we understand is that's very unlikely that session is going to end Friday. So they're ultimately going to extend it. And at this point, we really don't know what that looks like or what kind of the time frame for that might be. But we wanted the opportunity for the colleagues here and those listening in the audience to just understand kind of where we stand. So I'm just going to do a quick overview of the bills and kind of talk a little bit about what they mean and what that may look like. So I'm going to start with both House Bills 1221 and 733. What we understand about those two is those have both passed through committees. Some of the votes on those were closer than others. They both went to the floor last Friday, and they both passed, which was expected based on everything we're hearing from, our state association and folks that are closely kind of monitoring things. So kind of just to do a quick overview of what these bills look like, essentially what they would require is that 75% of TDT revenue would be used as a property tax credit, and that would essentially eliminate funding for tourism promotion, marketing, and tourism facilities in the manner that we all know and understand its uses for currently. What they would also accomplish, if passed, would be to dissolve every TDC in the state of Florida by the end of the year, and it would also mandate that a public referendum on TDT was held after an 8-year period. So that referendum is something that would be voted upon by the residents of the county based on, their desire as to whether or not there would be a continuation in the ability to collect TDT funds. So that's really kind of the very general overview of HB 1221 and 7033. What I would like to share with you all and those who are watching online is that, everything we're hearing from our colleagues along the Panhandle, from our state association, and those who are walking in the halls of Tallahassee and having the conversations is there's really not an appetite or a desire to see the language as it is make its way through the Senate. That's kind of what we're hearing. And really, we've also been told that there's really not a huge appetite, on the part of the governor right now to see this go through kind of as it's being presented. So I think, all in all, that's kind of good news on that front. What I would say is it's, always important for us to acknowledge and understand that, nothing's over until it's over. So I think, we need to continue monitoring. We need to be mindful in making those connections and having the conversations, where those conversations need to be had. I think another, thing that we're kind of keeping a pulse on at this point is SB 7034, and that deals with, taxation. And essentially what that does is there's language in there that, outlines the provisions of the TDT and the conditions that allow those funds to be used for infrastructure improvements. So currently what that says is you can use TDT funds for infrastructure improvements if you at least spend 40% of all TDT revenue to promote and advertise tourism. That's just one of the 4 conditions that kind of go along with that particular section. So just as a frame of reference, on our current budget, we spend about 24.3% of our total budget on actual marketing. So, as we currently sit, we're nowhere close to spending that 40% on marketing. So when you look at what the language change would be in that SB 7034, they're keeping the 40% threshold, but what they're changing it to say is essentially at least 40% of all TDT revenue collected in the county, up to a total of 50 million annually, are spent to promote and advertise tourism. So just a subtle language change there. So that's really the big, piece that would be looking at being changed in that current legislation. And then another thing that folks are kind of keeping an eye on and looking at is HB 7033, and there's language in that bill as well that would expand which counties could use funds for lifeguards. So that's, something that I think a lot of folks kind of see as a positive at the end of the day. And then Senate Bill 1664 is also one that deals with local option taxes. So this bill has language that would require the TDT to be renewed by referendum, kind of similar to what I had mentioned earlier. And so what that language says is it would ultimately require a referendum to occur before 2033. And Clay will correct me if I'm wrong, but basically it would say, require a referendum before 2033. However, as long as a new expiration date is included in the referendum, you would not have to go to referendum every 8 years.
That was the discussion.
Right. So, these are things that, we're keeping our eyes on and we're monitoring. So I'd love to just, kind of open it up to the folks up here to, offer any insight or kind of share what they're hearing, ask any questions. Josh, yeah, certainly.
So the 40% threshold for marketing that we're talking about, does that mean that the excess funds beyond that, I know we got beach operations, you got administrative costs and everything tied into that as well. That's beyond the 40%. So if the board decided that, hey, we want to dip into TDC funds for infrastructure improvements, because I think that's where the legislature is trying to pull from this, is to say that we want to cut property taxes or ad valorem, but then we're looking at ways to fund the rest of government once we do that. How are we going to go about this? Am I right or wrong in that assumption? And then are they just kind of putting stopping points at where the board, the BCC, or anybody else can draw from those funds?
So the current rule is that you can use tourist development tax dollars for public infrastructure projects, roads, bridges, water, wastewater, solid waste collection, basically capital improvement projects is the best way to think of it. True capital CIP list is what you would think from the city, for instance.
Right.
To do that, one of the requirements is that 40% of your budget must be spent on the marketing element of tourism. So that means if you collect $10 million, you've got to spend $4 million of it on marketing. The other 6 can be spent anywhere within the allowable confines of 125.0104, and that would then include potential infrastructure projects. The other elements of that are you have to have, there are a variety of other parts have to be added in, but it does require the BCC to approve it by a 2/3 majority vote. But I'll touch on probably the most important of the 4 elements that is probably the biggest hurdle. There has to be an independent professional study and analysis done that correlates the actual issues between what infrastructure you're improving and tourism. There's got to be a
Connection.
and it's not just a one-sided one. And I will say the independent professional analysis part has been the part that most have had the hardest time around the state establishing, because you can't just have somebody who's doing studies for you all the time do it. You can't have somebody who's industry-related doing it. You can't have the contractor who wants to build the road do it. So we, however, our challenge exists much more on the ability to get up to 40% of our spend would require a monumental reformation of our budget. We haven't been at 40% spend perhaps in the past 25 years.
Mr. Rack, can you touch on the impacts of these cuts from TDC funds and what it would mean to the local economy as well?
Yeah, and what I've included in some of your information is just an analysis that Downs and St. Germain, our research company, put together that kind of talks about, some of the impacts. And, I think on the broad scale, I think if there were to be, a push to truly, divert these TDT funds to, other uses, I think broadly that would impact, our ability to manage and maintain the beach amenities, to clean the beaches, to maintain the infrastructure along the beaches, to support our lifeguards, our sheriff's office, arts and culture, local events. I mean, I think truthfully, it's anything that we do and touch, would suffer, severe cuts in funding mechanisms. I mean, not only that, but also, you're talking jobs of people in the community. What we understand is that the tourism economy supports more than 30,000 jobs in Walton County. And so, you start to, get away from, marketing and, ensuring that we're bringing, the right visitors to our destination who will respect it and treat it right. You start putting an impact on, our restaurants, our businesses. You have to start laying people off and reducing their staffing levels. It's less, community-oriented events and things of that nature that we can do. So if you kind of look at that sheet that you have in front of you, you could look and see what, a 10%, reduction in visitation really equates to, a little over 1,100 jobs and, $55.7 million loss in labor income. So, that's just looking at a 10% reduction in visitation. And what you would expect is the less you market and draw visitors here, you would see those percentages increase dramatically. And I think, that's incredibly detrimental to our economy, which is based on tourism. So, there's a great case study out there that Longwoods International did that relates to Colorado. And Colorado went through an exercise where it basically eliminated all of its funding support for marketing. And, it was detrimental to their economy, and it took them more than a decade to even get back to a base level of where they were. So there's a lot of case studies out there that, speak to the negative impacts of not marketing. I think what we all understand is, marketing is essential. That's why companies like Coca-Cola and Nike, you're always in that, frame of reminding people who you are and why you're there. And, what I would also add is, I think it's worth mentioning, I kind of ran through an exercise with the CFO the other day and asked her, if the county had to, generate, just call it $60 million in additional revenue to fund everything that's funded by the TDT, could it? And her response was absolutely not. And then, okay, if we understand that, if the county had to generate that $60 million in additional revenue, what would that look like? And she said they would have to raise the millage rate by 1.5 mils, which equates to an approximately 42% tax increase. So that's pretty telling.
I think I'm on. Am I on? Oh, hi. I would also add that any $500 tax rebate barely offsets the fact that one might lose their job and not be able to pay their mortgage at all.
Yeah, very true. And so I think, what we all understand is, there's certainly negative, repercussions if something like this were to go through. And I think, at least based on what we're, hearing, that doesn't sound likely, but, once again, I think it's imperative that, we continue to monitor and we continue to, engage in conversations with, the folks that help make the decisions on things of this nature, because what we do understand is tourism is the #1 economic driver in Walton County, and this is what fuels jobs and puts our residents to work.
I've seen other counties sending out alerts, asking for help with advocacy in reaching out to our representatives. Is there a plan for our TDC to do so?
Yeah, so we've been working on messaging internally, kind of waiting to have some conversations at this level with the council members in the BCC, but we've been working on messaging that we're ready to deploy to not only talk about the value of tourism and why it matters and why we need to support the tourism economy, to kind of give folks a little bit of that call to action to make sure that we're having those conversations. Yeah, we're currently working on that messaging and pushing some of that messaging out as well.
I mean, I just want to echo, I think it's good that you got this information in such a concise format for all of us. Obviously, we've all been following. I would hope that the state of Florida would look at the case studies. The one out of Colorado was really shocking. I read the entire thing. And, this would have very, very serious implications on our local economy, and it's obviously very concerning.
Yeah, no, I think you're 100% correct. And, there's really, once again, what we're hearing is really not an appetite for this. And I think that's what's important to convey. But once again, what we understand is, things can change. And so just, continue to be proactive and continue to keep our pulse on things and monitor. So, I think with that, if there's any questions, in the public, I think we're certainly welcome to address any questions from anybody in the audience. But then we do have one other, item that might be worth touching on as well. But while we're kind of talking about the TDT related things, I'd welcome any questions if there are any. Perfect. Yeah, I think the only other piece that deals with legislation that might be worth touching on, and I may defer to my legal counsel here to my left, is just Senate Bill 1622. Obviously, we know that there's been a movement on that, and there's been some things happening. So, Clay, would you be willing to just give a little insight into where things stand there?
All right, it looks like 1622 has moved forward, and it looks like that will be going to the governor for signature. Of course, 1622 is the repeal of the previously implemented customary use legislation. I will note for Walton County, of course, Walton County's cases were, with limited exception of what's on appeal, fully resolved at this point over 2 years ago. The case was scheduled for a full trial in 2023. So in terms of what does this bill do for Walton County, it directly does not do anything with regard to the customary use issue because our matters are behind us. I think the county certainly recognizes and appreciates the legislature's efforts, though, to make sure that other counties and other cities in the state don't have to go through that same process. It was a very long and arduous process for the county to get to where they did. I think the county, though, does welcome the inclusion in the bill amendment that addresses beach restoration projects. That is one of the county's missions and certainly one of the TDC's missions. We have a penny that we have allocated to beach renourishment, and we've worked hard on a hurricane storm damage reduction project now for many years. And we hope with this language and the included language of that bill, that will help us move forward with that. And certainly in the parts of the county where we have done a full beach renourishment project, Miramar Beach most notably, we do not see nearly the level of public beach access concerns because of the public beaches that lie seaward of the established erosion control line, which is set when one of these projects is done. So as we're moving forward towards restoring public use of the beach, beach restoration is going to be that path for the county. So it is very good to see that included because it opens up another avenue, or at least perhaps makes that avenue a little easier to traverse than where we were before. Anything you want to add on top of that, Matt?
No, I think that's just, for the good of the group and the good of, those tuning in, just to kind of understand, where we're going and where things seem to be, looking ahead for what's next. With that said, I'll open it up to the council or anybody up here who may have anything that they want to add or touch on. I would just say, what I would suggest is just keep the lines of communication open. I think, if you get the opportunity to, extend a thank you to Representative Shane Abbott, he did vote no, on the TDT bill. So I think, we probably all owe a thank you there, as well as to Griff Griffiths as well, for kind of sharing that, sentiment in, in their respective side, whether that's popular or not. So I would just say, we all probably owe a thank you there, but I think it's imperative just to keep the dialogue open, keep having those conversations, and, reminding our community of why, tourism matters, and why, what we do makes a difference in the community that doesn't, come out of the general revenue fund.
We have a motion to adjourn.